My husband doesn't love me anymore. Maybe this heart-wrenching thought has crossed your mind recently. If so, there are two things to recognize right away. First, even though there may be some signs your husband isn't in love with you, you can't know for sure until you actually talk to him about what's going on. There may be an infinite number of reasons your husband might feel distant or seem unloving at the moment, even though he may still be in love with you. Secondly, and most crucially, if you're worried that your husband isn't in love with you, you have a problem about whether or not that turns out to be true. Even if nothing has changed at all in your husband's feelings for you, the fact that you're questioning his feelings at all is a signal that something needs to change in the relationship so that you can feel more secure. We reached out to couples therapists to ask about how to know if your husband is still in love with you and what to do either way. Signs your husband isn't in love with you. 1. He's no longer affectionate with you. People are generally affectionate with the people they love, and the sudden or gradual disappearance of that affection may be the first sign that a person is falling out of love. A big sign is when he stops doing the little things that he did just because. Marriage therapist Racine Henry, PhD, LMFT, tells MBG. Has he stopped making you coffee in the morning or bringing you flowers on a random Tuesday? Note, different people may express love in different ways, hence, the 5 love languages, so a lack of gifts or kisses alone doesn't necessarily mean your husband doesn't love you. It's a change in behavior and a decrease in previously present forms of affection to look out for. A change in routine can be a glaring clue that his feelings have changed, Henry says. For some, a shift in libido can also be a sign that love is waning. Clinical psychologist Carla Marie Manley, PhD, adds, though of course there can be many reasons a husband doesn't want sex other than a lack of love. Some related signs to consider. He is no longer affectionate with you, physically or verbally. He no longer makes sweet or romantic gestures toward you. He doesn't say, "I love you," anymore. He still says, "I love you," but something about it feels hollow or forced, like he's just going through the motions. He doesn't kiss you, hold you, or really touch you at all. His libido has decreased, or he simply no longer initiates sex. He does sometimes want sex, but it doesn't feel particularly intimate, connective, or even fun. 2. He spends a lot of time alone or out of the house. Another sign is how he chooses to spend his time, Henry says. If he has more excuses to be away from you and/or away from home, it could be because he's finding pleasure in other activities and people. A man also doesn't necessarily need to be leaving the house to be seeking time away from their spouse. Many husbands retreat into work and hobbies naturally, Manley says. When a husband routinely begins to overwork, spend more time with hobbies, or chronically engages in activities that decrease couple time, it's a sign that something is wrong. Some related signs to consider. It seems like he's always working these days, and he also doesn't seem to mind it. He retreats into his hobbies whenever he's not working. He never seems to have time to just hang out with you anymore. He's been spending a lot more of his downtime with friends, and you're generally not invited. He doesn't check in with you before making plans anymore. He often makes commitments or plans that will definitely reduce the amount of time you spend together. He has abandoned many of your shared routines, preferring to do things on his own. 3. He doesn't really engage in conversation with you anymore. When interesting conversation has disappeared from the marriage, it's not a great sign. If a once communicative spouse is no longer interested in bonding discussions, fun interchanges, or daily banter, that partner's level of loving affection may be decreasing, Manley says. Note, sometimes people go through phases of being too stressed, distracted, or simply disconnected such that they're simply not feeling particularly chatty after a long day of work. So talking a little less than you have in the past doesn't necessarily mean your husband isn't in love with you anymore, especially if it's only a recent or temporary phase. Some related signs to consider. He doesn't have deep conversations with you anymore, ever. He doesn't even have fun, daily banter with you anymore, ever. He doesn't ask you about your day. He doesn't ask you about your life in general. You feel like he doesn't really listen to you when you're talking. He doesn't really engage when you're telling him about something going on in your life. You only ever talk about logistics, the kids, or the news. 4. He's become closed off. Many men are not raised to be as in touch with their emotions, Henry notes, so if this has never been your husband's thing, it shouldn't be alarming. But if you've noticed your husband has shifted toward being more private and less open with you than he has been in the past, that might be a sign that something is off. Think about how much he talks to you and opens up about his fears and plans, Henry says. If your husband has become more closed off to you, this could be a sign that his feelings have changed. Some related signs to consider. He doesn't talk to you about his inner world anymore. He seems to be facing his life's challenges by himself rather than involving you. He seems uninterested in having you support him. He never really tells you how he's feeling. He confides in other people when he's having trouble or needs help with something rather than coming to you. 5. He no longer goes out of his way to care for your relationship. Is your husband as concerned as you are in maintaining the relationship and making sure the two of you are feeling connected and secure? In some cases, a husband may tire of the investment required to keep a relationship healthy and fulfilling, Manley says, which could be a sign that he's not as invested or maybe falling out of love. Some related signs to consider. He doesn't really bring up any relationship issues anymore. He brushes off conversations about the relationship. He just nods along passively in such conversations without really engaging. He doesn't check in with how you're feeling about the state of the relationship. He doesn't really talk about you as a lover or romantic partner anymore. He no longer suggests date nights or fun things to do together. He sort of just doesn't seem to care. What it means if your husband is not in love with you. If your husband says he is not in love with you, it's important to critically consider what you want to do and how you want to move forward. Importantly, the marriage doesn't have to be over if your husband is willing to work through this with you and wants to find ways to fall in love all over again. According to Henry, it's about recognizing the difference between being in love and loving someone. Being in love doesn't equate to whether you love someone or not. I think being in love can be an ebb and flow, whereas loving someone should be more constant, she explains. The marriage doesn't have to be over because feelings have changed. I think it's unrealistic to expect that the intensity or level of feeling will be the same over time because circumstances can have negative impacts on the relationship. Perhaps something has pulled you and your husband apart. But if you're both still committed to working on the relationship, it's possible to bounce back. On the flip side, if your husband knows his feelings won't change again, or he isn't willing to put in the effort to see, then it may be time to consider divorce. It's also worth noting, because many people may wonder, if your husband says he isn't in love with you anymore, Henry says it doesn't necessarily mean it's because he's in love with another person. There are many reasons people fall out of love, and most often it has to do with people simply growing apart. Maybe he's going through a transition, or maybe you've changed without realizing it, she says. In a marriage, partners need to communicate frequently because they are individual people growing at different rates. What to do next? 1. Identify what's changed. If you're worried that your husband is no longer in love with you, the first thing to do is get clarity on where this story is coming from. What dynamics are you observing in the relationship? What feelings are you experiencing, and what behaviors are triggering them? Assess where these feelings are coming from and figure out if this is a real or perceived change, Henry says. Try to come up with concrete examples that demonstrate the changes you are feeling. 2. Talk to your husband about it. When you're ready, bring up your feelings and observations with your partner. Manley stresses the importance of being open, honest, and respectful when you have this conversation. Use I messages, and listen carefully to your partner's responses. Take time to let the responses settle in, and strive not to be defensive, she says. Then, really invite your husband to share his experience of what's been happening in the marriage. Be willing to hear his feedback and experiences in the marriage, says Henry. Try not to accuse or assume. 3. Decide what you want to do next. Once you and your husband have clarity about what's going on, and he's shared whether or not it's really true that he's no longer in love with you, then you can mutually talk about what you want your next steps to be. If your husband is game for working on the marriage, that's a terrific sign. Unless one or both partners are unwilling to work on the marriage, including attending therapy, returning to a place where both partners feel loved and valued is truly possible, Manley notes. You may benefit from journaling about your thoughts and feelings as you think through what you want, she adds. One or both of you may find that it's too hard to return to the way things were, and if so, you may need to honor those feelings. 4. Work with a marriage therapist. If you feel lost in the decision-making process, or can't seem to get through conversations about this difficult topic, Manley says working with a professional might be helpful. If you and your partner want to refresh or save the marriage, seeing a skilled marriage therapist is a wise move, she adds. Many people don't take this step and later regret not having tried. Here's our full guide to couples therapy. 5. Make small changes together. If you do decide that you're willing to work on your marriage together, then it's time to start making small changes as a couple to recreate feelings of intimacy and affection in the relationship. Try to come up with a plan together about how to get back on track. Be patient with yourself and your husband as you work on repairing the marriage, Henry says. Keep in mind, your husband will need to make efforts to make sure you feel loved and secure going forward, but likewise, there may be changes you need to make too. If there are areas where you feel you could improve, e.g., being more communicative, do your best to evolve in that way, she says. No matter what, any self-work you do will benefit your mental and emotional health in the long run. The bottom line. While there may be many clues that signal your husband isn't in love with you anymore, you can only know by having a direct conversation about it. If it turns out to be true, it's up to both of you what comes next. You can choose to work on rebuilding your marriage, or you can choose to leave it. Both options are valid, and both can be healthy paths forward.